I'm Nick Hirshon. I'm a journalism professor here at William Patterson. Thank you for joining us for our last Hobart reality check of the spring semester, the last one of the academic year. As you know, these discussions are sponsored by the Communication Department and the William Patterson chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, which is part of a national organization that advocates for journalists' rights. So I'm going to begin our conversation tonight with some questions for Christina, but I want you as the audience to get involved, and Maria just mentioned you can get involved on social media. We're going to have questions that you can throw up there using hashtag Hobart Reality Check on Twitter. Okay, so throughout our conversation, if you have any questions, at some point towards the end, we'll put up hashtag Hobart Reality Check questions. That's the only way we'll see your questions, so make sure you're using that. We'll put those questions on the screen second half. Thanks to Dr. Rob Quick for his support of this series, and Rod Holliday and Bree Testa, who are running our tech, and Maria Zuniga, who's curating the tweets for us tonight. And that brings me to our guest. So Christina Carrega graduated from St. John's University in 2007, where she majored in journalism and minored in international studies. Her professional journalism career began as a freelancer with the Canarsie Courier, as well as working as the newspaper director for the Greater Ridgewood Youth Council, a nonprofit after-school program located in Ridgewood, Queens, in New York City. Since then, Christine has been a news editor for the Queens Daily Eagle and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle newspapers, as well as a criminal justice reporter for the New York Daily News, my former employer, and the New York Post. During her career, she has covered wrongful conviction cases and has thoroughly reported on high-profile trials, including People versus Chanel Lewis, People versus Peter Liang, and the People versus Wayne Isaacs. After Liang's conviction, which we're going to talk about during our conversation, Christina exclusively uncovered information about a juror's past that could have caused a new trial. The New York Association of Black Journalists have awarded Christina first place for Best Spot News in 2014 and 2017. And in 2013, she was a finalist for the National Association of Black Journalists' Best Single News Story. She also has volunteered as the co-director of First Take, which is the New York Association of Black Journalists' high school journalism workshop. She is currently an award-winning journalist and a news editor at ABC News Digital on assignment with ABC's Investigation Unit. So please join me in welcoming Christina Carrega to William Patterson University.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Christina. So you're visiting our university in the midst of graduation season. I was telling you as you were coming on campus, we were only a few weeks away from a lot of the folks actually in the audience tonight from graduating. Yeah. So I want to kind of start like thinking like you're a commencement speaker and you want to give these folks some inspiration or whatever. By what motivated you to become a journalist? Why is it important to you, and why do you think it's still important? I know it's big questions. We're going to get into a lot of details later, but just like, why did you decide to become a journalist?
Well, first, I would like to congratulate all the upcoming graduates who are in the room. Give yourself a round of applause. You made it. Yes. Long years. And those who are in the journalism major, I hope that you guys continue on and do graduate with your undergrad in journalism. So I've always wanted to be a journalist. I feel like when I was a kid, I asked a lot of questions. I asked why a lot. It may have been annoying to my family members always saying why, but I felt like I needed to know more information. I found myself interviewing Heathcliff the cat. It was a cartoon back in the 80s, in case those who aren't aware of what that is, and recording and asking questions to the cartoon. And, I realized just talking to my relatives who are, I'm a first generation born American, hearing their stories of how they came over to America and all those different types of things, I thought, like, well, if my family has stories like this to tell, it has to be other people who can speak to those kind of things as well that can be related. So I wanted to get to become a reporter, investigator, and I stuck with it throughout. It wasn't an easy transition, obviously, to get to where I'm at right now. It was a lot of red tape, a lot of people telling me things that were quite controversial from high school, in college. It was a long journey, but I stuck with it, and I didn't realize that I was going to be where I'm at, didn't know newspapers was my goal, and now I'm in broadcast. It's been an interesting journey.
And so beyond the reasons why you personally became a journalist, because you have that curiosity trait, which a lot of journalists say they have, and I think that's part of the reason why I became a journalist too. What about the mission of a journalist appealed to you? There's so many different things we hear about why a journalist does what they do, the idea of helping people make better informed decisions through your coverage, but what was that for you?
I think my internal theme is that everybody has a story to tell, and I want to tell it in my way that I think will make it more relatable to the audience. So and wanting to know the truth of things. Like, why is it that one block would have so many potholes, but then in another neighborhood, it's smooth sailing, right? So those questions of why and looking into it and digging is what I think the goal of a journalist is to figure out what's going on behind your backyard as well as in Washington. You just can't keep yourself secluded to just one topic. You have to keep yourself well-rounded, and I feel like as a journalist you should be well-rounded in all different types of areas and being able to have a conversation about anything at any time, and just educating the reader is really the main focus.
Well, and you make a good point about being well-rounded, which is good for our students to hear, that not just focusing on journalism, but it's good maybe if you have a minor in political science. We hear a lot of people who want to be a politics reporter, sports management if you want to be a sports reporter, et cetera. All those other sorts of minors will help. But I want to talk about one of the organizations that you're involved in, because our event tonight is sponsored by the William Patterson chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And during my introduction of you, I mentioned you're involved with another organization that represents journalists that probably a lot of students here are not that familiar with, the National Association of Black Journalists, and we'll throw the NABJ logo up on the screen right now.
Okay.
But to give some context to our audience, NABJ, as it's often abbreviated, is a network of media professionals who advocate for Black journalists, and it boasts 3,000 members and offers professional development workshops, writing and editing seminars, career assessment sessions, really very similar to what SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists, would do. And I know you're specifically involved with the New York chapter, NYABJ. So can you just describe why you joined NABJ and some of the work that it does?
So when I was in college, I wasn't in any type of social organizations. I was in my school newspaper, and that was it. And I did my internships, and then I did my part-time job at the school's bookstore, and that was it. I was so focused on just graduating on time. 4 years, that's it. So when I graduated, and then I got into the New York Post, where I was a copy kid, which is it's a position where you're in the newsroom and you learn the ins and outs of everything involving how a newspaper is formulated, which I think that's the only newspaper in the country that still holds those types of positions. It doesn't pay very well, but it gets you in the newsroom, and it gets you the experience that you can't get within an internship, I believe. So while I was out on the field, how I met Nick was, he was in the competitor's newspaper, the Daily News. I was at the Post, and I met a lot of my close friends till this day working in the streets and meeting other people. And that's one of the beginnings understanding of networking for me in this industry. So while I'm out on the field, I actually met a reporter. His name is Michael Feeney. He has since passed away, but while he was here, he was a big advocate for NABJ. He went to a HBCU university, which promotes different diverse organizations, and NABJ was one of those. And he was actually the chapter president for the local chapter and at his college campus. So when I met him, he was like, "Are you in NABJ?" And I'm like, "What is that?" Because I went to St. John's. It's a private institution. It didn't really promote certain diverse groups. So when he said it, he had to educate me on what it was all about. And as I explained to you guys, networking is such an important thing in this industry. I mean, right now you're sitting in a room full of people where you see them, you're like, okay, I might know their name. I might have had a class with him, or I might have had a class with her. But I'm telling you, that person you're looking at might end up being your boss, or might have it in a newsroom you're interested in, might have some type of information that you need on a topic that they cover because they become a beat reporter in a particular topic, and you need those type of insights just to tap into. So I'm telling you that to say, just say hello to somebody in the room, right? And then Mike had told me about NABJ, and he invited me to a local chapter meeting, and the rest was history. I got so engulfed with volunteering with the high school program because I love giving back. Because when I was in high school, I didn't have anybody to come into my classroom and tell me, you can do this. This field is tangible for you to be a part of. So I do that for that reason. And NABJ has been immense, when it comes to advocating for diversity in the newsrooms. Right now, the president, Sarah Glover, she's actually working on getting more diversity in CNN's newsrooms. She's put out press releases, she's having meetings, she's getting other organizations involved. I believe the NAACP is a part of it as well. And it's so important to have diversity in the newsrooms. And why is that? because you don't need people misidentifying one actor from the next, because, you know, the name might be misspelled or they might pronounce it incorrectly on broadcast. It's just those particular facets, as well as just having well-rounded individuals in your newsroom. You just can't have everybody from Yale in the newsroom, you know what I mean? So people like you guys would contribute to newsrooms in the long run, and it's because of organizations like SPJ and NABJ, it's why it's around and why I'm a part of it.
And we should mention that in addition to NABJ, there's NAHJ for Hispanic journalists.
Asian.
And there's one for Asian journalists as well. And so just know that, and I think there's one now for
South
LGBT.
LGBTQI.
So all of those, you know, are organizations that you guys should look into as, you know, potential outlets for you. So, all right, so thank you for giving us some context there. So I figured what we could do is maybe review some of the articles that you had sent me before we had our discussion tonight, and each of them kind of make a point about maybe a lesson we can learn in journalism, something that you had to go through while reporting it that I thought of as we were going through it. So the first one I'm going to put up here is, well, some images that relate to it, is from your time at the New York Post, and you covered a story in August 2012 about what you dubbed Camp Crook, and it was about a con man named Dejean Gathers, who I guess we have his photo up there now, who concocted a string of bogus local summer camps. So he promised parents fun-filled trips to Six Flags and Chuck E. Cheese for their kids, and then he ended up leaving them high and dry. They would go to these locations and find out, oh no, there's no program at all, so they paid all this money and it really didn't exist. It seemed like you reported this story, just based on my impression of reading the article, on sources that you had in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, but maybe you can tell me something else about the sources. But I know that you've been a courts reporter for a while. You obviously covered a lot of criminal justice stories. So how do you develop sources? I thought that was an interesting thing to discuss here, like especially prosecutors, judges, you know, when you're covering the court system.
Actually, you'll be surprised to find out I actually learned about this story through one of the people who was actually wronged by Mr. Gathers, which was a person who thought they were going to have a summer job, and when they showed up for a summer job, there was no job. So this whistleblower gave me all this information about this guy and put me in touch with parents who were wronged, talked to the kids who were wronged. I mean, there was a lot of people who were wronged by this man. I believe it was 5 locations, 3 in Brooklyn, 1 in the Bronx, 1 in New Jersey. This guy held a career fair at a church. He put himself out there as a minister, and it was all bogus information. So it was me taking time out of work, because at the time I was still working in the courts, I believe in Queens for the Post. And I met up with the source. I sat down with her, met up with other people who were wronged by this gentleman. And then I spoke to the parents, and it was a lot of taking time out of my beat to go and speak to these people out and where they are. And then I pitched the story. I didn't tell my editors what I was doing. I was like, I'm out talking to sources, and they just let me do that. Because as a beat reporter, you have to have meetings with people just to figure out what's going on. And sometimes the source meetings don't go anywhere. It might just be you chopping it up, saying how you doing, how's your summer. But those conversations go, they benefit in the long run.
Help develop a relationship.
Absolutely, right. So after digging into finding out that he also utilized Living Social for these purchases, I reached out to Living Social. I reached out to the DA's office only after I got all my information to say, hey, are you guys investigating this? And at the time, they didn't even know that this was happening in Brooklyn, right? So I actually tracked him down. He was in Georgia. He didn't answer the phone. I called a neighbor. A neighbor was like, yeah, he's outside mowing his lawn. What did he do this time? Come to find out, this gentleman was actually pulling off another scam years ago. He got arrested and went to jail for, which was a apartment scam. He would put out advertisements on Craigslist. People would pay the down payment, get the key, get to the apartment, and somebody else is in there. You know, the guy is just a scam artist. He ended up getting indicted by the Brooklyn DA's office. The fugitive task force went and got him. It was a whole thing. And he pled guilty. Some parents had to sue him for their money back. The Living Social people immediately gave the money back to those who purchased through there. Yeah, no apology from him. I think he did 9 months in Rikers, and he's back out there in the streets. But that was a very interestingly that took about a month for that to come together.
And so the way you first returned onto that story was because someone had called the Post or emailed you or something about it?
It was a relative of mine who
Okay.
then put me in touch with somebody who was like, I've been waiting for this job to start and now I have no job. So I felt the need to tell her story.
So and this is a theme of a lot of criminal justice stories, so the ones we're going to talk about, but how do you go about identifying and then interviewing people when they've gone through something difficult? And this is maybe only the tip of the iceberg compared to some of the people who've been victims of crimes that are more physical in nature or emotional. But how do you go about being sensitive during those interviews, or just getting someone to open up about, hey, I was just swindled by this con artist and now a reporter's on my doorstep? It can be kind of a jarring experience.
Sure. I mean, this, like you said, it's not exactly something like a violent crime, but it's still something that's emotionally involved, and it's embarrassing to some people to actually say, I got scammed, So just being empathetic, giving a kind voice, relating to them just like you relate to your sources, just being a human being. I think that's the way you get people to open up to you.
Sure. All right, so we're going to move on to another one of the stories that you covered here. After you left the Post, you were a reporter at the Daily News, my former employer, and in June 2018, just last summer, you covered this story about a Brooklyn man named Sundhe Moses, who served 18 years in prison on a bogus murder rap, and there's a photo of him up there right now. So while he was behind bars, he racked up a $40,000 bill for child support that he was unable to pay because he was locked up. He couldn't make a living, and so he couldn't pay child support.
Right.
And you had interviewed him for this story, and he told you, quote, I waited so long for this day, now I can move forward, end quote. So again, questions here about the art of the interview. You're interviewing a man who was wrongfully imprisoned for 18 years, and then when he finally does get out, faces $40,000 that he has to make up for, in addition to starting his life anew and finding a job and all this. So how do you approach interviewing a gentleman like him?
So this is an interesting case because Sundhe, he was out on parole since 2013 and still was fighting to clear his name for this wrongful conviction. So he had hearings set up where, he had to have a judge decide whether his case was credible enough to be overturned. So he was out since 2013 until his hearings were finally held. And during all the adjournments, I would see him, his mother, his sister, his lawyer, and every adjournment they saw me there. And every adjournment I would speak to them, and then they would open up more and more and more and more. So even after the hearings were done, which one of the most infamous detectives, Louis Scarcella, was behind his case, just everybody covered those, but after the exoneration was put in place, Sundhe, he pulled me to the side and was like, this is not over. And I'm like, well, I know you got to probably file your lawsuit, right? He's like, no, I have other fish to fry now with family court. I'm like, what could, and then when he told me all this, it just became like this whole thing. Right. And even when I reached out to the Department of Probation and Parole to be like, listen, you got to figure this out, because they even had him still on parole even after he was exonerated. And that took 2 months for them to clear it up. And I think because I kept calling them and saying, why is he still in the system as on parole? And it was just, I think the doggedness that I showed him, that I wanted to make sure his name was fully clear, he kept giving me more stuff going on with him personally. And again, just being persistent, being in his face and his family's face all the time as a consistent person, they felt like they can trust me to tell me more stuff, and that's where that story came from. And
throughout that process, are you getting a lot of feedback from editors? Are you getting constructive criticism, or is it just more they know that you're reporting, they trust you? Because it seems like, especially in your case, they gave you a pretty long leash there and were willing to say, well, we trust her as a reporter and she's going to develop her own sources. And that may be increasingly rare in newsrooms now. It's much more, you're assigned to this and this, and then you got to move on to the next thing. So were you kind of your own editor in the sense of assigning yourself to what you're covering here?
Yeah, I mean, as a beat reporter, essentially every day I would get up and I would have what stories I was going to tell them I was covering, and then I knew the stuff that I was going to be doing on the side. So it's what you call feeding the beast, right? So I knew things were going to be happening for the day, so I'll send my pitches and they'll say, okay, I'm covering this for the day, and they'll be like, okay, so in their head, they will say, Carrega's out doing this, right? So I'm on the skeds doing this. But then on the side, I have other things going on. So I prioritize my day to fit everything in. And then sometime during the day, I would send them an extra sked and say, listen, I got something else I picked up on. And they're like, okay, great. So it's kind of like they trusted me enough. And with the wrongful conviction stories, they deemed me as the girl to go to for those. So any kind of case when it comes to wrongful convictions, I was the one that they called to say, hey, hey, how many cases does Scarcella have? How many cases did the Brooklyn DA's office overturn? And I would know the numbers off the top of my head. And I mean, Brooklyn is the epicenter of wrongful convictions, and I covered the majority, and I know the majority of these men and woman, the one woman, who was exonerated through the conviction review unit. Yeah.
So it's just also having a nose for news, I guess, and knowing what is so important to cover, and that it's an issue that has been getting a lot more attention in recent years,
Sure.
I think. All right, so we'll move on to another story you covered for the Daily News. This was last July about a man named Jahmal Lightfoot, and I think we have a photo that we can put up of him. And he had been convicted of second-degree robbery, and then he was locked up at Rikers Island. But that's where the story kind of takes a turn here. So he was locked up at Rikers for robbery, but then he was beaten up by correction officers when he arrived. He eventually filed a civil lawsuit, and as a result of that lawsuit, he was awarded $3.9 million. So you have someone who is convicted of a violent, crime that they committed, but then ends up getting all this money. And you interviewed the woman who he robbed, who's named Yvette Cruz, and she was frustrated about this turn of events. Obviously, she's still dealing with the trauma of the robbery, and yet now this issue is occurring with him getting all this money for supposed trauma. So let's talk about interviewing victims of trauma like robbery. First off, how would you handle something like that when you're trying to talk to somebody who is, I think she was shoved to the ground or something like that as part of this robbery attempt. So how do you approach that? It's even more delicate.
So in this particular, I'll do two parts to this question. So when you're faced with some person who's a victim of a crime, again, soft tone, not condescending, not seeming like, oh my God, I got to get to my next appointment, rushing the person, because these are traumatic moments. And the fact that they even entertained a phone call or entertained opening the door or even standing in front of you, you have to give a lot of respect for that, right? So when you're sitting with them, it's a lot of eye contact. They may start crying. Always have a pair of tissues ready to go. Maybe a piece of candy. Like my bag. My mom was in the audience. My bag is so heavy. Why? Because I have stuff just ready to go in case I have a victim in front of me. And I hate the word victim because most of these people are survivors of particular traumatic events, and even saying those words to them, they appreciate it a lot. And I come to the table understanding that and respecting that. So when I'm speaking to any victim or a parent or, a loved one who lost someone, and it's like 5 minutes after they just seen their relative's body on the ground, you just definitely have to come in prepared to not be so judgmental. You got to throw all of that out the window. You have to be objective, which is like a journalist's mantra, right? You got to go into your story objective. You have to interview objectively, and that is the energy I do come with. Is this a question?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay, I'll answer that one question. Okay, objective is meaning that you're not putting your personal opinions or biases into your copy or during the interview. So if you feel a certain way about anything, like say you don't like people who wear jean dresses, you're not going to come to interview me and just be off-put. Your face is making up. You're not making eye contact. You're just being judgmental. I'm not going to want to talk to you anymore, right? So you have to come in and put those objective opinions in the back of your mind and just come in with a clean slate. You have to do that with every interview, right? So for this particular story, Ms. Cruz, she reached out to me after this story about Jahmal Lightfoot came out, and she was very upset. She reached out via email, and I could tell in the email she was so distraught. So I was like, can you give me a call when you get a chance? And she sent me the email like January of 2018. And she didn't call for like a long time. And then I finally got a phone call, and I think I was in court, and I got a voicemail, and I listened to it, and she's crying on the phone, and she's telling me about exactly what she wrote in the email. She repeated exactly what she said, and I said, okay. I called her back, and she didn't answer. So we played phone tag for like months, right? Finally, she emailed me, and she said, okay, I'm ready to talk. And I was thinking to myself, like, I'm not exactly sure what she's trying to say, because she was more or less ranting about the fact that this man got all this money. What about me? What about me? And then I thought to myself, well, I don't know how my editors are going to take this story, because I understand her pain. Every person who's wronged in some way, there's a cause to that effect, especially when it comes to a criminal justice story. As you said, this man was in jail for a robbery, right? He became a victim of a beatdown of corrupt correction officers. But ultimately, why was he there? He wronged somebody else. And some people may say, oh, that's karma. That's why he got beaten down. People have rights. Just because you're in prison doesn't mean that you should be getting beaten up.
Sure.
You know what I mean? No matter what the person did, right? But ultimately, people forgot about why he was there. And I felt like she deserved to get her story told. And the fact that he pled guilty, that means there was no trial. What does that mean? There was no victim impact statement read out loud. There was no cameras in the room because it was a second-degree robbery. Reporters aren't covering second-degree robberies.
Right.
Even though this woman was just on her way to work innocently, she just left her car, she was walking to the Metro North station, and she gets pushed and shoved by this man, and she tried to run after him, and he was too fast down the hill on a bicycle, gone. And she's there bruised and battered without her purse or anything. And still to this day is still dealing with that. So I felt that she deserved her story to be told. So when I met up with her in Bryant Park, so I'm again leaving my beat, and this was after hours, like court was done for the day. She wanted to meet somewhere public, and it freaked her out that it was public. And to get her to take a photograph with the silhouette shot, I don't know if you guys have that picture available, but
yeah, I think it's actually
the artistic view of it, like we wanted to make sure she was totally comfortable with everything. We showed her the shot. Susan Watts was the photographer. She took the picture, she showed it to her. She was very comfortable with it. I was in constant contact with her even when I was writing the story, and then I pitched it. And then I pitched it to my editors because I got the photographer to come, but I didn't tell my editors yet, right? So then I told the editors the story, and they were like, oh my God, this is so powerful. And it was because of the pitch that they were like, we're gonna do it.
Right.
I didn't expect it to be on the front page. Happened to be the day after we all got laid off from the Daily News, but that's neither here nor there. But
yeah. But, well, and that's kind of going to like knowing the inner workings of a newsroom, because I've warned students a lot of times, if you're going to pitch something to an editor, they're going to want it like right away. Certainly that was the case at the Daily News when I was there, and I guess your experience too, I'm sure the Post, a lot of daily newspapers. So you don't want to promise a story and then find out that, oh, she got cold feet, she doesn't want to talk anymore.
You don't want to do that. And
then your editors are like taking it out on you. So instead try to like get as much of it as you can done in advance. And so then when they're like, we want it right now, you're like, okay, I already did all the reporting, I have the photograph ready, so it's all yours. I just want to bring up something you were talking about earlier about your bag, because you were saying, you carry around like candy or whatever. So, reporters often grapple with this line that we're not supposed to cross. We're supposed to be neutral. And so if we have somebody in front of us who is emotional, it can be difficult sometimes, like if she's there in front of you and she's crying. And do you offer her a tissue? Do you try to be a little bit of a therapist? It's like, so where do you come down on that when you're dealing with her or anyone else who is a survivor of a crime? Okay,
for her, I had my tissues ready, and I gave her a tissue because you just to just be empathetic. I understand the whole standing back and just letting the person cry because it'll be good for the pictures, but once that, we did the photographs first. We didn't do the pictures while we were talking, which is something that she wanted. Because again, this was such a sensitive topic for her, and she's dealing with so much still, going to therapy. Her daughter had to come meet with her to sit with her just so she can talk. It was a lot. So it's for me to impose on, wait, get that shot, Susan. Like, come on, like where are you as a human being at that point, you know? I get it. Like some TV shows may show these cutthroat journalists being just like all about themselves just to get the story or a byline. At least for me, I'm not, if it's gonna crush my integrity, I don't want it. So I keep my human part first. Right. It's a big part about being a journalist, compassion, right?
Absolutely. So you have to have that as well. Okay, so there was a powerful quote that I wanted to actually put, we're showing her right now, a powerful quote that was in that story where she critiques the news media, and I wanted your kind of feedback on this, because she told you, quote, when you read articles about this incident, it says he was awaiting sentencing for a robbery. That's it. That's just a few words, and the readers get sympathy for him. But I want them to have sympathy for me. So what do you make of her sentiments there? Because we're covering the fact that he's getting this $3.9 million settlement, but we're not really mentioning, but like, hey guys, he's not the most sympathetic figure in the world. He committed robbery. That's why he was in Rikers in the first place. And so I think she has a point about sometimes the way the news media covers things in a short-sighted way, doesn't give a lot of context. So it's kind of interesting that as you're interviewing her, she's kind of critiquing your very own industry. So what do you make of that sentiment?
I mean, what am I gonna do, attack her and say, listen, I only have such much of a word count, like why ruin the interview at that point, right? But sometimes we do have limitations, especially prior to print going to online immediately. We definitely had a limit of words, especially at the Post. They want everything short. They want it very tight. And I always used to argue, but what do we have a website for? You have a limited space on the website. Why you got to crush it down to 3 paragraphs? But, you know, if we were to put in every single article about Jahmal Lightfoot, pending sentencing for a second-degree robbery of Yvette Cruz, who was in the Bronx on her way to, too many words, and it just, you know, it loses the reader on what the story was about. You know, I mean, you can add it probably at the bottom, but who, these days, honestly, people aren't spending that much time on the page. They're not reading the full article, and people lose the real context of things. So just mentioning it was second-degree robbery, you just have to leave it like that. So that's just what it is, you know, unfortunately.
Yeah, and again, obviously, I didn't expect you to say anything to her in person. No. How dare you critique my industry? But more of that, you know, it maybe gives us introspection and like think about, oh, actually sometimes, you know, newspapers, reporters sometimes move too quickly through an issue, don't really consider everything that's happened in that, the way we're framing this case as in, you know, he was wrongfully beaten and it's great that he's getting $3.9 million in settlement. Maybe we're neglecting some of like, okay, but what happened there and how might someone like her feel like that about it? So, you know, it's important that you did that kind of reporting. There's another line in that story that I wanted to talk about. You say, attempts to reach Lightfoot for comment were unsuccessful. So can you just give us, first of all, an idea of like how you attempted to reach him? Because there was a photograph in the story that showed him with his attorney. So sometimes you would think, I guess you'd try to contact the attorney and see if he's available for comment. But can you just talk about how you tried to get in touch with him, and then in general, the importance of reaching sources even when they're unsympathetic for comment, to get the side of a story from people who we sometimes say they're a monster, they're a robber, they're, you know, convicted of a crime. What's the importance of doing that? So
for this particular case, one of my sources or people I would go to for stories are Sanford Rubenstein and Scott Rainecki, who were Jahmal Lightfoot's attorneys. So before I even like pitched to the editors and wrote the story, I told them, this is the story I'm doing. I'm gonna be reaching out to your boy. I hope that he answers the phone, and they gave me his phone number. If I didn't have that connection, I would have had the research department at the News get the report, call his phone, you know, reach out to his relatives, maybe stop by his house in the Bronx, you know, take the efforts, right? But I had his direct cell phone, and I called him several times. I mean, this story took about 3 weeks to get together, and I gave him enough time to reach back out. And of course, you know, the lawyers weren't going to comment because they got their check from the settlement. You know, they're like, he's not our client. He's our client, but he's not our client anymore. So, you know, that was fine. They didn't want to comment. And I reached out to his mom. I reached out to his relatives. He was not interested. And at one point, the mom was like, listen, he really doesn't want to talk about this. And that was fine, you know, so that was the line in the story. What my mind, and this is sometimes reporters might do this, they go into doing a story and they think that this is how they want the story to happen, right? But it always doesn't end up that way. And for this story, in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, I'm gonna get him to apologize to her. And then, you know, he'll say all these things. Maybe he'll offer to write her a check from the settlement. All of these big money moments in my head that I knew wouldn't happen. It was big thinking, but eventually I had to put in the reach for comment, couldn't get it.
And again, the importance you think of reaching out to someone in that situation is that for
your
fairness.
Name is written in a story. If you don't reach out to me for comment, that's just unfair. It's not telling the full story. It's just telling one side of the story. And again, for journalism, you have to tell both sides of the story. So I wanted to give him his justice in other ways by getting him to say something.
For sure. So we've been talking about your work for the Post and the Daily News. Now you work for ABC. Can you just give us an idea of what is your title, what are your duties on an average day at ABC?
Okay, so I'm a news editor for a broadcast station online. So what that means is that I work closely with different shows. Like I did I helped out with an episode of Nightline. I get to work with 2020. I get to work with GMA. I get to work with a lot of a lot of shows that do the stories for ABC. Aside from that, I edit a lot of copy from the other reporters, and the topics can range from the new Kit Kat flavor to, I just actually had to write a couple of stories over the weekend about the latest synagogue shooting, which is, unfortunate, or, a guy who was arrested for killing 5 people in Tennessee, so I'm covering stories not just in New York anymore, it's all over the place. So my knowledge is wider now. I know about a lot of criminal justice things happening across the country, which is interesting. And, I still cover things here in New York, which are nationally, they range for the national audience as well, which the Chanel Lewis case, as you mentioned earlier, is one of those cases because it was a Nightline episode. So it's nice to work with broadcast now. I've been in print for over 13, 14 years, so now it's an old brave new world over there.
So how is that different? Because, first off, we can talk about the actual content, when you are interviewing sources, for example, how are you going about that reporting process? Because now it's, instead of, I would imagine as a newspaper reporter, mostly you want to meet people in person and get the emotional connection, all that, but with this, you must be largely conducting phone interviews, emails, stuff like that. So how has that changed the way you gather information?
It's frustrating. I don't know how reporters can be full reporters in a newsroom. This digital age has changed the whole idea of journalism, in my opinion. People are curating articles, or they're aggregating articles from across the country that are original content and just rewriting it for their copy. And there's no original pieces, and they figure embedding a link into the article is them giving credit to somebody, but they didn't even make their own attempt. So when I came to ABC, it's only been 2 months, but the one thing that my bosses have appreciated is that whenever I'm working on a story with a reporter, I ask them, did you call such and such police department to get your own comment? Or did you reach out to the family to get your own fresh comment? And I'm giving them that opportunity to really do the reporting, because I just can't tolerate a whole bunch of, according to such and such affiliate, according to when you could simply just call the prosecutor's office, email them to get the criminal complaint. That's all you got to do. So I think I'm offering a fresher perspective on how to be a digital reporter, and I pride myself on that because I feel like it's the way journalism is going at this point, it's losing that personal connection that is very important in this field.
Right. And that willingness to work that you're saying, just like email, internet in general, I guess, makes us lazy sometimes. And so remembering that, like, you can pick up the phone, you can actually, God forbid, go out and meet somebody in person and get the information. How about, you were talking about at the Post and I guess at the Daily News, I certainly experienced it, you don't have a lot of words to work with, and now you're working for a website, so you'd think you'd have, as you mentioned before, like limitless space. Go ahead, Christina, write 3,000 words. But we know that actually people's attention span may be even shorter when they're looking at something online, they're scrolling on their phones really fast. So just in the formatting, are you writing shorter sentences? Do you catch yourself trying to write a shorter paragraph, or what's it like writing these stories?
It is difficult. I did a deep dive on fatal hit and run cases across the country, and it was such a rabbit hole because I reached out to all different aspects for that particular story. It ended up being like 1,700 words. And my editor, Will Cruz, was like, Christina, you gotta cut this down, right? But when I'm editing other people's stories, I realize what can be eliminated. So I'm using that when I'm doing my own writing now, right? Because as you said, people aren't reading beyond 30 seconds, maybe. I think that's even too long, right? So you do have to realize that the cutting down of words and using careful parts of the story to put it up high is very important, because to get to that last part of the scroll is just, it's impossible nowadays.
Right. So we have all the space, but we know that people really don't read it in that format.
And it's
anymore.
A shame.
Yeah. It's tough sometimes as a journalist. Actually, we'll start looking at some video clips now, because one of the many responsibilities of the modern reporter is making television appearances to discuss the stories that you covered. And I think that's interesting because a lot of people get involved in print journalism because they say, I don't really want to be on camera, I'm kind of shy. Like, they may be very dogged, determined people, which obviously from your describing your reporting you are, but then when the camera turns on, they're sort of like, oh, that's not really for me. So we'll show a few things here. You appeared on a true crime television series on the Oxygen channel named Snapped, and you discussed one of the cases that you covered. For those in the audience who don't know much about Snapped, and I didn't before I researched it for tonight, it depicts high-profile or bizarre cases of women accused of murder, including women who kill a cheating husband or because they want to end years of abuse. The clip that we're going to watch stems from a 2013 murder that you covered. So let's watch this clip, and then we'll talk on the other side about this case in particular, but also just in general about how do you prepare for TV appearances, let's say. So we'll try to get this clip going.
So odd.
And so that clip kind of leaves the viewers in suspense, so I'll tell you what happened. The Brooklyn woman that you saw was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2017 because she hired a hitman to kill her husband for $900,000 in insurance money that would clear her debt. So that kind of gives you a description of the story. And again, you can tell us about this case, and if you could also just describe this preparation for being on TV. Sometimes, TV makes us want to like say things that are dramatic, even if they're not completely accurate or whatever. So I'm wondering, when you're going through this, are you, tempted to kind of like go overboard, or do they coach you on what to say, or just in general, anything about that you would like to talk about?
So for this case, it was only myself and the New York Post that was actually in the courtroom covering this trial. So when the production company reached out to me, they were like, we need to know what happened in the courtroom because the case is still in appeal, so they couldn't get the prosecutor's perspective on what happened in the courtroom. And I covered the case every day. So it was actually like it was a very emotional trial. I mean, both sides, every trial is emotional, but this one was like particularly odd because the woman was so cold. She just was so like, and I waited for her to like shed a tear at some point. She even testified on her own behalf. You got nothing from her. It was just weird, right? So even me talking about it right here, the producers loved it. They were like, oh yeah, say that. Yeah, we want that. So me just speaking, they wanted those type of words. So I didn't get from them any type of like, well, can you say this or can you say that?
That's
so
good.
It was essentially me doing my reporting and expressing what exactly I saw in the courtroom.
Okay,
Yeah.
So that part was good. And then your actual reporting the story, anything memorable about how you got sources or how that reporting played out?
For this case, it was just sitting in the courtroom listening to the trial and pitching it that day and getting it in the paper or online. And essentially, this story wrote itself. This is tabloid gold. You got a woman who's cheating on her husband, sneaking the guy she's cheating on him with in the house. They got a whole thing going. There's a life insurance policy. It was just like middle America right in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Crazy stuff.
You noted when at the start of this clip they say in the troubled Brownsville neighborhood.
The troubled.
So what's your opinion on that?
I'm a Brooklyn girl, so I'm like, man, come on. Like, if I could walk down the street in Brownsville and be fine, it's not that bad. Yes, the crime rate may say differently, but to me, Brooklyn is not as bad as and then, people in Wisconsin are going to watch this and be like, oh my God, that Brooklyn. I just
Exactly.
don't need anybody clutching their pearls when they think about Brooklyn, It's crazy.
No, that's I think you make an important point there of like, for people who haven't been here, the media framing of something, when they first say, ooh, Paterson, New Jersey, Newark,
bad?
New Jersey, right?
Oh, okay.
People think about the in a bad sense, right, about the crimes that they've seen on TV, but it's not maybe all that dissimilar from when we hear in the news, like growing up about like the Middle East, and so you'd say, oh, I'd never want to travel there
Sure.
because it's just suicide bombers everywhere, because that's what we're used to seeing on television.
Yeah.
So like small words like that we just like are used to like throwing into a story. I just thought it was interesting that you reacted to trouble, and that it's maybe a lesson about how we frame things. Okay, so let's move on to another one of your television appearances, and this one's from ABC's Good Morning America.
Oh, it's a throwback.
And here, throwback. And here we're going to see you discussing a 2012 murder involving a man who said he had strangled his girlfriend due to uncontrollable rage stemming from his mother neglecting him as a child. So let's see you talk about this, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Okay.
Who's blaming his mother for his brutal killing of his girlfriend. The jury in this case will hear from a consultant, in fact, from the TV series Law and Order, to help back up his claim. ABC's Mara Schiavocampo tracking this case for us. Mara, good morning.
Josh, good morning. It's an unusual defense, to say the least. Jason Bond's lawyers claim he suffers from a post-traumatic mental illness because his mom, a successful publishing executive, abandoned him for her career. He's an accused murderer blaming his mommy. 35-year-old New York lawyer Jason Bond has admitted to brutally beating and strangling his girlfriend, a 27-year-old Weight Watchers executive. Now, in his trial on first-degree murder charges, Bond's attorneys say it's his mother's fault. Experts testifying he was traumatized when his mom, successful publishing executive Maureen O'Connell, began devoting herself to her career when Bond was just 10.
The doctors and social workers all agreed that Maureen O'Connell abandoned her children because she wanted to pursue her career in publishing.
Prosecutors say the murder was cruel and intentional. In June 2012, Danielle Thomas was found in the apartment she shared with Bond, her body in a tub filled with ice. Officials say this surveillance video taken on the day of her murder shows the Ivy League-educated attorney buying ice. Investigators note days later, Bond left this voicemail message for an ex-girlfriend.
Danielle is dead. I don't remember anything that happened. I think I pushed her.
In court, prosecutors also played another message. This one left when one of the couple's cell phones accidentally dialed a friend as Thomas was being attacked on the night of her death. A recording so troubling, her family had to leave the courtroom.
She's repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe."
But in an unusual legal turn, the defense says Bond's mommy issues can create an uncontrollable rage. Forensic psychiatrist Alexander Sasha Barty is a key expert for the defense. He is also a consultant for the crime drama Law & Order SVU. Barty claims Bond suffers from intermittent explosive disorder, having violent bursts of anger when reminded of his childhood. Bond's mother has not been in court, but is reportedly using her $1.3 million salary to fund his defense, all to keep her son from paying a hefty price. Now, though Bond had pleaded not guilty, the defense is now seeking a conviction on lesser manslaughter charges. In a statement, Bond's mother says she is, quote, horrified by this tragedy, and her heart goes out to Miss Thomas's family.
So as we're watching these clips, it strikes me that you, like a lot of journalists, have covered a lot of crimes, and I'm curious how you've handled that aspect of it. It's actually a conversation that we had with Sarah Armagon, our friend, who has been a reporter for Newsday and Daily News, and has covered a lot of crimes as well. So just to give some background here, the Columbia Journalism School runs a project named the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, and they've investigated the occupational hazards for journalists who regularly cover traumatic events such as car accidents, fires, murders, wars, disasters. They say that most journalists tend to exhibit resilience despite repeated exposure to work-related trauma, but there is a significant minority that experiences PTSD, depression, substance abuse. It's an aspect of journalism that we don't often consider, taking care of yourself. So I'm curious your own strategies, because it could help some of our students here who might be in those situations. When you're covering those kinds of issues, how do you make sure to practice self-care? Are there any techniques that you use that you found are helpful? Or they say a lot of journalists are just resilient. Is there some resilience that you find?
When I was at the Post, I couldn't figure out, and I was at the Post for 8 years now, and I couldn't figure out how to actually do self-care, and I didn't realize I needed it. It wasn't until I got to the Daily News and I told them, listen, after hours, my phone is not gonna be by my head. Do not call me after 10. I'm not answering an email. I had to set boundaries because I realized that having the phone literally by my head, and I had two phones. You had the work phone and you got the personal phone, because you just never know which phone the editors were going to call you on, and you don't know which, would have lose service for a moment. Now you're all concerned about missing an email, so all of those moments were just like, I realized were just awful. You can't live life wondering about your boss and when they're going to call you. It's not cool. So when I left the Post and realized that I was going through that, it's like a boot camp, if you will, at that place. It was a great experience, but it was like the training wheels of journalism. I mean, it was great to build me up to where I'm at right now, but it taught me to set the boundaries. So at the News, I made sure to let them know, those time frames. If I saw a case that was a little too much, I would tell them, like, listen, this is too much. I got to take a break from it. I need to step back. Because in the end, all you have is yourself in the end. The newspapers aren't going to keep you warm at night, right? And they're not going to rub your back when you're hurting, or, you know, if you're sitting down in the courtroom too long and those benches start to get to your posture. You know what I mean? Like, you really have to understand that you guys, when your body says stop, you have to stop. I know I go in when it comes to this world of journalism. Like, I love everything about it. I need to get involved in every shape and form of it. But then I realize sometimes I have to just say, wait a minute, I got to stop. Go on vacation, take a break. When my days offs happen, I'm not checking my email. I just know I have to remove myself. So that's the way that I'm able to at least keep my sanity in some way, shape, or form with this field. Yeah.
And is there anything else that, you know, about covering this particular case that you want to tell us?
In this particular case, the parents of Jamie Thomas Jamie Thomas Bright is the mother of Danielle Thomas. Her and her grandmother were in the courtroom every single day. And I got to know them. Once again, we're Facebook friends, and they live in Kentucky. They invite me to go to the Derby all the time. They're very nice people. You know, anything that happened after this case, they will let me know about it. The family did sue the city of New York because Danielle did call 911 before she got murdered, and the police never showed up. And he killed her in about 2 hour time span. Like, he choked her, let her loose, beat her up, choked her, and it was all caught on this voicemail message. Had the police had shown up the first time that she called 911, they could have saved her life. So the family did let me in to know that piece of information about the case after the fact. And this wasn't a case that was covered by all the news outlets. When it first happened, you know, Weight Watchers executive, Ivy League lawyer, it was in all the newspapers. But at the trial, at that point in Queens, the press room was so empty. And I don't know if you recognized where the interview was taking place was inside that press room. And I was the only reporter in there. Zambito had gotten laid off already. And, you know.
Who's another one of our reality checks guests, by the way, Tom Zambito.
So he was out, and it was just me. I was the only one holding down the press room for about 3.5 years until I left the Post. So I was able to just be the only reporter in the room, and of course the details of this trial coming out, it caught national attention, and it was on Good Morning America, as you just saw.
Well, all right, so I have some other questions and maybe another clip to show, but I want to try to get to questions from you guys. So again, if you have any questions, hashtag Hobart Reality Check, and we'll start to show some of those up on the screen. But anything that you guys want to tweet. So mostly we're seeing some of the comments. We do have some questions coming in here. Okay, so Ashley asks, what do you like most about reporting on criminal justice?
What do I like most? I will say the biggest part of criminal justice that I enjoy is attacking the policies of the system and really exposing and explaining how criminal justice works in the system for the layperson. And when I do any type of discussion with any person, like most of my friends will call me and say, Christina, what does that mean? What do you mean this premeditated, all these words that get thrown around? What is voir dire? You know, these words, you know, arraignment. I don't know what that means. I enjoy explaining what these legal terms mean for the layperson. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really under-discussed, I guess, part of journalism about giving context to situations, like you say. Like, what does all that mean? I mean, we hear it all the time, like convicted, arraigned, whatever, but yeah, what does it actually mean?
Right.
That's a good one there. We have a question here from our secretary-elect of our WPSBJ chapter, Leslie Campos, saying, do you think that the empathy and compassion that you have as a journalist is what influenced you to choose criminal justice reporting?
Interestingly, I didn't choose it. I think it chose me, because it was a certain point of my life I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I think I even took a test to get into a junior high school for law and journalism. I think that was the name of the school in Crown Heights, and I didn't get into the school. But it was either I'm going to be a lawyer or I'm going to be a journalist, right? So when I got into journalism, it was like, okay, I fulfilled that one itch, right? And then there was a point where I'm like, should I take the LSATs? And then when I was going to leave the Post, I threatened to leave. And then they were like, oh no, we need you to cover in the Queens courthouse. And I was like, the courthouse, I'm going to be in the courthouse. So then everything just came together. So I even have like a criminal law book in the house and at the office, because need to know everything about it, and educating myself on it. So in my sense, I could probably defend you or myself if you get arrested, because I think I know so many tricks, and I even give defense attorneys some advice sometimes that they actually listen to. And, you know, doing these particular trials, I see things, I hear certain things, and it's really cool to just be a part of it without being a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ah, that's very nice. Okay, we have one from Maria Zuniga, who's right up here right now, our president. It was going away, but you've had the opportunity to be both a reporter and an editor. Which one do you enjoy more and why?
I like editing to do that whole aspect of teaching the reporter. We had an intern at ABC who just left last week, and when I first edited his copy, I realized there were a lot of things missing. So I asked him, I said, are you open to hearing suggestions? You know, that's the first approach. And then he was like, yes, I'll take anything. And I explained to him, like, here's a checklist of things you need to do before you send this copy over to me. Because as an editor, you don't want to end up having to rewrite the whole story. Because the one thing I couldn't tolerate at the Post was when you sent in the first copy draft, and then when you see the final copy and you're like, this doesn't even sound like me, right? So I want to be able to give the reporter the opportunity to still sound like themselves in the copy. So I enjoy editing for those portions of it, but I love being out of the office and just being in the courtroom or in the fields and talking to people, and I just love that. If I could have both, which I've been doing at ABC all the time, I'd be happy. But for some reason, you can't do both, because if you are an editor, you have a laundry list of stuff to edit that day, and you got to get to all of it. So I can't be out in the field and doing this at the same time. So yeah, it's a blend of both. I love both.
That's great. We seem to have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll start to go through them quick here. John Fiorino, who is our vice president. Where do morality and ethics come into play when reporting on criminal justice? Is there something you do differently or a personal code that you believe in?
Interesting. Okay, so this is a really, I don't know, is he in the room?
Yeah, John's right there in the back. Okay,
good question. So the People versus Peter Liang case, and I believe the article I sent over for you in particular. So this trial was historical for Brooklyn, because it was like the first police officer who was indicted locally for killing an unarmed civilian, right? The fact that there was an indictment was a big deal, because around that time, if you remember back in 2014, 2015, a lot of police involved shootings were going viral, and then you'll hear no indictment, and then people would rally, and then the Black Lives Matter movement came about, and then you got the new Black Panther Party coming through, and it was just a lot of anti-cop situations going on in America during that time frame. So in November 2014, when Peter Liang was convicted of causing the death of Akai Gurley in East New York, Brooklyn, in the projects, and then there was an indictment announced in February of 2015, it was a big deal. So fast forward, you got the trial going on, and every news outlet you can imagine, from the LA Times, BuzzFeed, Gothamist, it was New York Times, everybody was in that courtroom covering. It was a section in the big auditorium courtroom for reporters, and it filled 6 rows every day. So me being a daily news reporter, if that was my house, because I lived there in the Brooklyn courthouse, it was like, okay, I'm gonna end up just doing the same kind of stories all these other reporters are doing, just with a different news organization on the top, right? Then when the jury got the case to deliberate, and then you got the verdict, and it was a guilty verdict, it was pandemonium. You had protests outside from people who were for Peter Liang, who thought he was a scapegoat. You got the family for the victim. You got the family for, it was just like a lot going on in the streets. Everybody poured out into the streets. It was freezing cold that day. I'll never forget it. And everybody's chasing jurors, trying to get the juror to explain, like, why did you convict her? What made y'all get to this decision? And everybody's doing the same stories, right? But it wasn't until I interviewed one particular juror, I believe his last name was Lopez. I can't remember his name exactly. And he tells me a piece of information about when he was in the pool of jurors. He was like, oh, that wasn't the first case that I was going to be a juror on. And I'm like, well, what case were you on before? And he was like, before they put me to the Liang case, I was pending to be on a jury for a triple homicide for Salvatore Perone. And I was like, well, how'd you get out of that one if you got into this one? And he said, well, I told them about my dad who was convicted of manslaughter, so they took me off the case. I said, your father was convicted of manslaughter and you served on a jury where it was a manslaughter case and you didn't tell, because I was in the voir dire process, the jury selection process. And he told the lawyers that he had no body in the criminal justice system, no ties to nothing. But you told upstairs one story, and then and it came out that he wanted to be on the jury that bad. So he lied. So here I am with this information, transcripts and everything to prove this man said what he said. And I'm thinking to myself, do I report on this and cause the case to be overturned, and then we have to do this whole trial all over again? Or do I report it because it's right, because no matter who the person is and what they did, they deserve a fair trial? And I picked the latter because at that moment I realized as a criminal justice reporter, it's not about the greater good of, what people think should happen. It's about the justice system being done correctly, and as a reporter to report it correctly and fairly. And I want to make sure that I go forward in my career, which I still do now, and making sure that defendants get fair trials. Even if they're the most guiltiest person ever, if that jury is tainted or if there is a missing piece of information that should have been turned over to the defense and I find out about it, I'm going to report it. So when it comes to my personal moral ethics, that's one of my personal moral ethics, and it was built because of that trial.
All right, great. We're cutting off some of the names here, but let's see, from Juliet, who is our current secretary, what risks are there in revealing a story? Are those risks worth it?
Well, not sometimes, depending on the situation, you have to tell the story. Like the story I just told probably answers that question. You just have to tell the story. You really do. It's not about your own, like if you have a best friend, like, do you know that if you tell this, that this would happen? You just have to tell the story because it's what you're here for. You're not here to hold evidence. You're a reporter. You're supposed to report. You're a journalist. You're supposed to tell the story. So.
But have you received hate mail or threats or anything?
Oh, hate mail, yes. You wear those like a badge of honor. Ask me if I've been sued. Absolutely, yes.
Really?
It's those things that if you get a lawsuit and they're like, I never said that, I never did this, you reported that incorrectly, this is erroneous, it's like, okay, yeah. Well, guess what? You said this because I have you quoted. I got you on record. I have my notes. Here's a lawsuit that I quoted from. I'm not making this up. I'm so standing by my reporting that lawsuits that come in, I'm good. I know they're going to throw that out. First Amendment rights. There's no judge that's going to hold this and say, yeah, this is something that's litigated and it needs to be litigated. So it's fine.
That's never a concern of yours.
Never a concern.
It's actually, it seems like the opposite.
It's fine. It's
you're
fine.
proud of.
Yeah, I'm proud of it. The hate mail is amazing. And the tweets now, because now you got bots and trolls.
Oh, right. So you're going to get
those are great. Yeah. I have a friend of mine who he was concerned that there's a Twitter account created with his name saying that he sucks. And I said, that's because you're doing your job. Be all right with that.
You own it. Exactly.
You own that.
We have Andrea Betancourt says, how do you go about pitching a story that you know will impact readers?
Oh, if it's going to impact the readers, then you just pitch it the way it's being said, Like, it should be obvious, like, my editor cannot turn this down kind of thing, If it's going to be an impact, it's going to be an impact for your editor first. That's your first reader, honestly, not yourself. Yeah.
You're always thinking about those two different audiences. We've talked about a few different stories you covered, but a good one from Alex Evans, who's the treasurer of our SBJ chapter. What's the most memorable story that you've covered and why? Is it one of the ones we've already discussed, or is it something else that we haven't gotten to?
Well, it's continuing, actually. The Chanel Lewis case is still continuing. That case has been big. I'm not sure if you guys have discussed it in your classes, but the trial is like, you got communities torn apart, you got history of racism in a community of Howard Beach, and you got a family who's lost their daughter, you got a defendant who his family has lost their son into the criminal justice system. It's just an ongoing case that it's memorable, but not the best one. I would have said the Liang story was the best one. But then prior to that case, I would have said the People versus Barbara Sheehan case was really interesting. This was a woman who claimed that she was repeatedly abused by her husband, who happens to be a NYPD detective. And one of his threats to her would be, go ahead, call the police. They're just gonna, slap me a high five. I'm gonna get away with it. And he always got away with any time she called the cops. One day she just couldn't take it no more, and she took 2 guns and killed him, shot him 11 times using 2 guns. And the trial went on for a long time. Everybody covered it, and then the jury came back with a very strange verdict, and it was they acquitted her of the murder, and they acquitted her of using 1 gun, but they convicted her of the 2nd gun, because they said after the verdict, she just did too much. She shouldn't have used 2 guns, just the 1 gun, right? Mm-hmm. She ended up spending 5 years in prison, and she got out. She's back in her home in Howard Beach, and her life she's still living in the house she killed her husband in, but she's fine.
Gosh, it's crazy.
No.
How are we doing with time, by the way, right now, Maria?
It's going to be 7:20.
Okay, so we have maybe a few more here that we can throw up before we go. So we have one here from Megan. You mentioned giving a fresher perspective at ABC. What skill can print reporters learn from broadcast journalists?
I think broadcast journalists are learning a lot from print reporters more than anything. I've been in print for so long that when I was interviewing for this position, I was concerned that my print skills were not going to transcend very well to the broadcast world. But they were like, listen, no, we need print journalists because you guys are more dogged when it comes to getting those details and making the stories, boom a little bit more. You're able to just get things done. So the broadcast world, it's shorter writing, like we talked about before. It's shorter writing, it's quick, quick at the draw. They want to get it out now because they're in this big competing world of, I want to be the first to report this and that. So I think my print skills are better for broadcast journalism at this point.
Okay. Anything else? We're pretty wrapped up there. Okay, sure. As a criminal justice reporter, how do you decide whether to share graphic or sensitive information?
Can I follow up with a question? What is considered a graphic and sensitive piece of information?
I think what we're talking, because this is actually, Andrea's in my class right now, where we were talking about the ethical decisions that journalists face. For example, if you have in someone's testimony, they're describing something violent that occurred, in a bloody body, someone being strangled, anything like that, and sometimes you have photographs of some of these things, or bodies coming out, blood, whatever. So how much would you use those photographs? But also just, I guess, in your own reporting, you probably have access to court documents that are very descriptive about what happened to a person. So are you including that kind of information? Because, obviously it might get more readers, it's sensational, but then you also have readers who will be offended by that or just think it's inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, one of my editors at the Post used to say, I don't want to read this over my morning coffee. You got to think of the person with their morning coffee, right? So they would sometimes just dismiss a pitch if it was a little too much, But I would write it in Word format, the photograph, so that people can understand that this is something that's really gruesome. For the instance, for the Barbara Sheehan, or even the Jason Bone case, that voicemail message, that 5-minute voicemail message of hearing a woman being strangled to death and hearing the defendant screeching in this really strange rage, just, we weren't going to put that on the website, even though we fought for access to get it, which is something that reporters, well, at least for myself, we're always fighting for access for evidence, because once something's put into evidence, it's public domain. So some judges will try to bar you from getting that, and you have to call lawyers in, or you have to argue for yourself to the judge, listen, judge, this, we're the Fourth Estate, we're entitled to access, it's the public's right to know, blah, 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 blah. You have to just give this whole argument to them. And if you do get it, just to get it for purposes, I would, if I feel like my morning coffee will get spilled on the paper because this is really a lot, or nobody wants to listen to this, just be as graphic with your words so that you can let the reader use their imagination for once again, Right. Visuals are nice, but I would stay clear of giving too many graphics over. But also, I would let the editors in the photo department or the video department make that decision based on whatever ethical standards the publication has.
Right.
So I would get it just to give it over and let them decide.
Sure. Collect information, let the bosses make
Let
the
them
decisions.
decide.
So as we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't covered tonight that you like to bring up, especially when you're thinking about our audience of college students? Are there things that you would have liked to have known maybe when you were in college that you discovered during your time in the industry? Or often I ask guests about interns that you've interacted with who are, current college students and the way that they're acting in the newsroom, and you might be like, ooh, they really need to know how to respond in this situation because they've done it the wrong way. Is there any sort of words of wisdom there for these kinds of folks?
It's interesting because I did bring up the one intern we did have in the room, right? And I felt like he stood out from the other intern that I didn't realize was an intern, because how was I supposed to know you're an intern? You didn't speak to nobody, right? So, and then he was very receptive with information and just taking in everything that I was telling him. And I think when I saw him and his approach to even saying anything to me, I thought, I didn't do that when even I was an intern at ABC, and I didn't speak to people, and I wish I did what he did. So I would say to you guys, whatever internships that you are at, to just be approachable, take on information, because there's nothing worse than an intern who doesn't want to be a sponge, right? Or they think that they're so full of every information they learned in their 101 class that real life reporting information is just, I don't want to do with that. You know what I mean? So I would just say be more receptive to just speaking to people and being open, because you never know what you're going to learn from them.
Sure, great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you again, Christina, for coming all the way out here tonight for joining us. Let's give Christina a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good.